Good afternoon. Welcome to the CVP Speaker Series at GW. Today's event is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in STEM. I am Shamaa Ahmad, Executive Director of Business Transformation here at CVP. For those of you new to our speaker series, CVP partnered with the George Washington University to create an ongoing speaker series focused on key topics in today's world, such as change, innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship. Before we jump into this exciting event, I would like to introduce CVP's CEO and founder, Mr. Anirudh Kulkarni. Anirudh is a George Washington University alumni and serves on the Dean's National Advisory Council for GW's School of Engineering. Anirudh, over to you.
Shamaa, and thank you to GW and the School of Engineering for continuing to partner with us on the CVP Speaker Series. You know, over the past many years, our country's demographics have changed rapidly, and so too are the ways we think about gender, color, and identity. You know, especially in the workplace, employers have an important role to play. Today, CVP is a 500-person, mid-sized, advanced technology and consulting leader. But without setting any goals, we've achieved a workforce that today is about 54% minority, 40% female, with almost 50% of all of our senior managers being female. This diverse workforce is really a result of where we recruit, who screens, who interviews, and how well our internal referral programs work. And generating a feeling of inclusion really has to do with culture in the workplace. And that's something that we work on to nourish at CVP every day, and it's led to industry-leading retention and engagement rates across our workforce. I will say that role models matter as well. And today's panel, all accomplished industry and academic leaders, serve as role models within their organizations, and through their example, are doing their part to create a more diverse and inclusive culture. I look forward to hearing from the panel today. Thank you. Back to you, Shamaa.
Thank you, Anirudh. As Anirudh mentioned, CVP is an award-winning business and next-gen technology consulting company that helps organizations navigate disruption and prepare for a culture of continuous change. We solve critical problems for healthcare, national security, and public sector clients by leveraging technologies and industry expertise in areas including technology modernization, health, data science and engineering, business transformation, and cybersecurity, while continuing to focus on making sure our workforce is diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Today's event is our sixth one in the series, but only the second we have held virtually due to COVID-19. You can find out more about this by visiting our website at cvpcorp.com. We are excited to be hosting this event, exploring the important topic of why there isn't more diversity, equity, and inclusion in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. We have an amazing group of panelists who will be sharing their views and lessons learned, but before we get started talking to them, I would like to note a few housekeeping items. We will be recording today's event, and it will be available for viewing on our website at cvpcorp.com. For all of our attendees, we will be sending you a link to the event recording, so keep an eye out for that in your inbox. And throughout the webinar, we will be taking questions in the Q&A window, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Time permitting, we hope to address as many of them as possible, so please feel free to send them in. With these items out of the way, let's meet our amazing panelists. Panelists, as I call your name, please introduce yourself, provide a brief description of your background, and also please tell us what the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you. Starting with Dr. Cynthia Mendoza, Chief Technology Officer, Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the U.S. Department of State.
Howdy and good afternoon. As you can see, I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. Being that I'm a native Texan and an Aggie, I'd like to look virtually. I know we don't have people in the room, but are there any Ags out there? I'd like to know if we have any Aggies around. If you are out there, let me know. I'd like to get to know you all more. I went to Texas A&M University. I received my undergraduate degree in electrical engineering. I've also been part of and grateful to be part of the George Washington community. In the George Washington community, I received my undergraduate from Texas A&M, my master's and Ph.D. in systems engineering. So throughout my life, STEM has been a very, part of me. both through my work life as well as working and in the community. I owe my life to the STEM, and I also the wonderful and great people that I've worked with throughout the STEM career. The other thing is that I've been grateful and have had opportunities that I've been able to embrace and make them real. So I'm really happy about that. So I've had opportunities that I want to share with you. So anyway, I'm glad to be here today. The first question is, what does STEM mean to me? What does diversity, equity, inclusion mean to me in the STEM field? Well, to me, it means creating a diverse workforce where we have folks that have different backgrounds, ethnic groups, different academic areas. We want to bring the diversity of thought together to solve complex problems. As you know, in STEM, we deal with creating innovative, complex, emerging technologies, and it's very important that we have the depth and the breadth across the community of stakeholders and the workforce so that we're able to do that successfully. And so what that means is that we need to make sure that we're fair and equitable across the board, that we provide resources for folks to be able to achieve their mission goals and objectives. And what I mean by that is providing mentors. It's very important that everyone has access to mentors so they can get the idea of what does it mean to be successful in a certain career field, and what can I learn, what are some of the lessons learned, and that kind of thing. So that's very important that we're able to leverage opportunities and resources for everyone in the group. So the other thing I want to mention is in STEM, we have to do the brainstorming piece. So what I mean by brainstorming, I mean the planning, designing, thinking, creating something new. We need to make sure that we have the diverse academic roles, the depth and breadth of different people bringing their thoughts together. We want to make sure that we don't just bring people who think like me, because brainstorming will just be like what I'm thinking. We need to have the diversity of thought so that we can move forward and be creative in how we solve complex, innovative solutions. So it's very important that we're able to do that and understand how we don't get stuck in a groupthink way. If we get groupthink, then we're not able to get the diversity of thought. So that's just a little bit of my 2 cents in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you, Dr. Mendoza. Our next panelist is Dr. Ekundayo Shittu, Associate Professor at GW School of Engineering and Applied Science. Dr. Shittu.
Thank you very much, Shamaa. My name is Ekundayo Shittu. As Shamaa said, I'm an Associate Professor of Engineering Management and Systems Engineering here at the George Washington University. My background is a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Nigeria. And then I proceeded to the American University in Cairo to study for my master's degree in industrial engineering before ending up at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst for my Ph.D. in industrial engineering and operations research. In terms of my focus, research focus, I tend to look at energy systems modeling, and I tend to look at optimizing those systems in response to uncertainties in policy. I've also diversified by looking at equity issues for underrepresented minorities, a group that I believe I am a subset of. So that takes me to the question, how do I perceive, or what's diversity, equity, and inclusion to me? I'll start by saying that, if you look behind me on my shelf are books by several publishers, okay? So I have a multiplicity of publishers of books on my shelf. Also, I have a multiplicity of topics on the topics that I cover in my research. Now, when you bring it to the context of DEI within the STEM field, we tend to sort of zoom in and take diversity as a representation of different identities. In other words, we're talking about race, gender. In some cases, you may talk about ethnicity, nationality, religion, and even to a certain extent, sexual orientation. So as you can see, diversity is all encompassing. And I think one other thing that underscores our definition of, at least the way I perceive diversity, is that these identities are groups that have in some ways received systematic discriminatory treatment or some sort of barriers to opportunities. One other thing you find with diversity out there is that it sounds nice. In fact, some people will tell you the meaning of biodiversity before they can tell you what diversity means in the context of DEI. But then when you step out and you kind of take out the euphemism that surrounds this fancy, schmancy word, because often you hear universities saying, we want a diverse student body. You hear companies saying, we want to diversify our employee, our workforce. But I think what they should be saying is, we want different identities. We want to hire more women. We want to hire more underrepresented minorities. We want to hire people of different sexual orientation. Specificity is key. If I may borrow the words of one of the leaders in this fairs, Verna Myers, she said, diversity is being asked to the party. And that takes me to what inclusion is. In other words, when you are not asked to dance, then you are being included. In other words, inclusion implies being valued, being recognized, and also being given that leverage to perform well on the opportunities that may be available. So when you look at firms or even institutions of higher learning making massive investments into ratcheting up their diverse, student bodies or workforce, you realize that without inclusion, it's next to nothing. In other words, you get people through the door. Yes, we have colored people. We have all minorities. We have all sexual orientations. But then the question is, how do those people feel about the system in which you are brought them into? Are they justifiably satisfied in the system? Are they welcome? Do they feel valued? That's where inclusion comes in. And, I'll keep quiet in a second. But one other thing you're going to find is that, on average, people think inclusion is just a natural consequence of diversity. That is never true. There must be the conscious effort to provide that equitable platform. Now, when we talk about equity, we're trying to refer to giving everybody the same access to the same opportunities. But it doesn't stop there, ladies and gentlemen. It actually goes beyond that because not everybody is starting at the same point. So when we talk about equity, we're talking about being mindful that different constituents of our workforce, of our educational setting, of the people we have in our organization are starting at different points. And as a result, will require different levels of support, different levels of engagement for them to be successful.
Thank you for that, Dr. Shittu. Very good insights. Our next panelist is Ms. Sheena Burrell, Deputy Chief Information Officer, Information Services at the United States National Archives and Records Administration. Ms. Burrell.
Good morning. I would love to be able to talk about my background, as my background is not a traditional STEM background. I graduated from Towson University here in Maryland, and I graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in Mass Communications. I was led to STEM through my experience through my career in government. I worked at the Social Security Administration for 15 years in the CIO's department, and then worked at NASA for another 3 years in their CIO department. As I continued in my career, taking STEM classes, continuing my education and furthering my education, I was able to continue in the STEM environment. For me, diversity and inclusion are traits and characteristics that make us unique, and the behaviors and social norms that people feel welcome, that make people feel welcome. It is more than just policies, programs, and headcounts. It is how we create a more equitable workplace, respecting unique needs, perspectives, and potential of employees and potential employees. And for inclusion, it's not just being invited to the table, but being a valued and contributing member of the organization and the conversations that we have.
Thank you, Ms. Burrell. And last but not least, our final panelist for today is Ms. Misu Tasnim, Executive Director at U.S.Digital Service, U.S.Department of Health and Human Services.
Hey, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, CVP, for the opportunity to speak today. My background is the more traditional route into STEM. I have a bachelor's and master's in electrical engineering from Hopkins University right here up the street in Baltimore. But my career trajectory has been a little bit less traditional. I haven't stayed in engineering directly. I stopped coding a few years ago. I started off at NASA, started doing software engineering there, moved into more generic consulting with the government, and have found my way into more policy spaces. So, like, I think to me, diversity, inclusion is not just diversity and inclusion, like Dr. Shittu was mentioning, at the surface level. And it is not about like identities. It is about us achieving equity. And that is the goal. The goal is equity. The goal is not diversity or inclusion. Those are two mechanics to getting to equity. And so even having taken that traditional path into a STEM field, right? Like, you are always an outsider when you are in a field that you are not, a part of, right? That, like Ms. Burrell was mentioning, she didn't take that path and had to educate herself in other ways. Similarly, I took that STEM path, but now have to find myself educating myself on how policy is written, how legislation gets written. So there's always learning, but there is always value in a opposite and opposing like life experience that comes from someone else. So to me, that is what diversity, equity, and inclusion is about. It is about the goal of equity with the means of diversity and inclusion getting us to that equity.
Thank you, panelists, for helping us get a little bit of a better understanding of what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you and why they're important to you. Moving on to our next question, Dr. Mendoza, please tell us how diversity, equity, or inclusion played a part in your personal path to STEM.
So as I mentioned earlier, diversity, equity, and inclusion played a major role throughout my life. In the early days, so I'm going to talk about in my early days, and then my college time, and then when I started my career path. So I grew up in a family with there's three girls. I'm the oldest of two of the girls, and my mom and dad, they were very successful. They held the bar really high. My mom retired as a principal of an elementary school, and my dad received his degree in his Ph.D. in material science and engineering. So while I was early in middle school and high school, it was all about science, mathematics, physics. My dad loved the physics, and I remember I was like, oh my gosh, this is so complex to understand, but he was able to break it down into small pieces for me so that I can understand that. So I've been working with science, technology, engineering, and mathematics through the early days. And then as I got older, I went to Texas A&M, like I mentioned, and I studied electrical engineering. When I went to Texas A&M, it was in the days where, as you know, Texas A&M is predominantly a male. They had the Corps of Cadets. Now it's changed where more women are there. But back in the day when I went to A&M, there was less women there. And I can recall being in a class, it was a senior class that I had. It was one of the electives for electrical engineering. And there's about 32, 35 people in the class. And I was the only female in the class. And I actually had a professor stand up and say that engineering is a man's world and women should not be in engineering. So you can only imagine how I would have felt sitting there hearing from that and having the passion and energy to want to do something, want to complete. So I took that with a grain of salt and I continued on. And for that class, it was one of those classes where you have a mid-test and then a final. So I go in and take the first test, and I did not do very well. So I was really stressed. I was freaking out. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So I went to see my professor, and I said, doctor, I took the first test. I did all the homework. I read all the problems. I read the book. I did other problems, from old tests. Can you help me out? Can you give me some advice? And he said, sure. He said, make a better grade on the next test. So I was like, thank you. I appreciate that. Roger that, copy that. So I moved on. And so what I did at that point is I went to I was the only female in the class. So I went and did an inventory, figured out who were the best and smartest men in the class. And I joined the smartest study group. So I was able to learn what I had to do to survive. I studied with some of the smartest people in the classroom, and I ended up with a B+. So that's just a little story how working through some of the diversity and challenges that I had through my early days in the undergraduate world. Once I took on my first job, I worked at Kelly Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, and I was doing C5 engineering. I really loved that. I got to work on the cargo airplanes, and we handled the challenges that went wrong with the different aircraft. So, of course, the first problem that comes up is this is back in the day when we paid. I know I'm dating myself, but this is back in the day when we had the $1 million trash cans. And so what was happening is we were paying money for a lot of the coffee pots. Each of the cargo airplanes had different coffee pots. They weren't standard and consistent across the board. So what it was leading to is huge inventories, which cost a lot of money. So they wanted to standardize that and figure out how can we get one coffee pot across the board. So I said, oh, well, we'll assign that to Cynthia. She's a female. She knows how to make coffee. And she will work the coffee pot. So I was like, copy that. I took it and went on because I had to learn all the electrical engineering behind that. And I took it, with stride, and I learned. So as you know, there's been challenges all along the way. But, what I can say is be confident and stick to it and keep, paving the trail and moving forward. So as you can see, it's played an important role throughout my life. I was a contractor for 23 years and faced some challenges in that. And now I work for the federal government. I'm really grateful for the opportunities that the federal government has given me. As well, in 2009, I became a senior executive. So I make sure to mentor and coach different folks and share with them some of the challenges that I have, so that we can make sure we get more women and more women involved in the STEM field, so that we can continue to grow women representation and diversity in all areas in the STEM environment.
Thank you, Dr. Mendoza. Ms. Burrell, how about you? How has diversity, equity, or inclusion played a part in your personal path to STEM, especially given that your background was not in STEM, or your education at least wasn't?
Absolutely. So as someone who kind of started off in a non-traditional STEM background, it had me have a very negative perception of my own career success in the STEM field. I constantly doubted if I was good enough, even though I took additional classes. I had mentors, people who really supported me. It's funny, even when we talk about just being diversity in general in terms of the workforce. Right now, being a mom, the fact that child caring and caring responsibilities are still overwhelmingly a stereotype that's a woman's job, it becomes a major barrier for many of us. I laugh as I had one particular supervisor. I had to travel for my job. And like Dr. Mendoza, my supervisor stated to me, "What about your kids?" And I was looking at my supervisor and said, well, my husband, I think he'll be able to handle it without me for a couple of days. And I laughed with him to say, it's not only my job as a mom to be able to take care of the kids, I also have a job to do and a job to perform. And that's something, even without being in the STEM environment, I think that some women struggle with if they can have it all. I've heard that in my career in the government is, can this particular executive be an executive and be a mom and be a wife? And I think that's something that we're overcoming now. I think the biggest thing for me was having mentors who did have very strong traditional STEM backgrounds to help me to see where there are gaps within my own career. Having a good support system. So I did talk about my husband, who is a very strong support system, who does help me. When I worked at NASA, I did travel quite a lot. Each month, I had to travel to a new NASA site, and I needed that support system. I also was open to learning. And I think that helped me just based off of my own background, not being someone who was in a traditional STEM environment and also having some of that own self-doubt. It made me very open to feedback, very open to learning new things, and not closing myself off to just new ideas, new thoughts. And that's really what has helped shape me when making decisions on who to hire. It is that diversity in thought as well.
So, Ms. Burrell, I'd like to follow up on that with the next question that we've got as well. You mentioned some of the challenges that you faced in your career. What do you feel are the barriers within STEM professions to valuing diversity beyond the couple of examples that you just provided?
I think some of those barriers are overcoming stereotypes. I also think some of the barriers are for minorities, as well as having the ability to have access to STEM programs. I think not knowing that there are those programs that are out there to help uh, young kids that are of minorities or children. My daughter, she is in a group of girls that code, and those type of programs really help us to overcome some of those barriers. I think continuing to have conversations about diversity and inclusion, no matter what field you're in, has been really important, because to knock down some of those stereotypes, the stereotype of being a woman and not being able to take on engineering, as Dr. Mendoza had said, or that you won't be able to learn how to read code or write code, or those type of things, or not be able to be fast enough in certain programming. All of those type of things are barriers that people do have to overcome, and especially as a woman. So those are just some of the things, being open to those programs. So
Thank you for that, Ms. Burrell. Dr. Shittu, as the Associate Professor for the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on this as well. What do you feel are the barriers within STEM professions to valuing diversity, aside from stereotypes, as Ms. Burrell just mentioned?
Thank you very much. In fact, I'm going to answer this question from two perspectives. As someone who has experienced some of the, points mentioned by Dr. Mendoza, and as someone who also is studying this topic. Okay, we've been studying this topic to a point where we're able to understand some of the underlying barriers, some of which I experienced myself. For all intent and purposes, this is my second academic job. I came from one institution where the idea of mentoring is just non-existent, for example. So when we talk about, some of the issues or barriers that, people come across in this space, you realize that it's one thing to have formal mentoring structures in place, but I realize that informal mentoring is actually the way to go. For example, since I came to GW, I have had colleagues, for example, Dr. Santos, who pulled me in and said, Dio, this is how we write proposals. And I learned in that process in an informal way. I've had colleagues like Dr. Van Dorp who said, Dio, don't focus on just doing energy modeling. There is other avenues for the skill sets you have. And I listened. Now, when I talk about informal mentoring, I'll add quickly as well that my former department chair, Dr. Mazuki, he walks into my office and says, Dio, let's go get coffee. I felt welcome. And that explains why I have succeeded. Now, on the studying, studying this topic aspect of what's going on, research shows that minority students are as interested in pursuing STEM fields as their white counterparts. However, we find that they get in quite all right, but by their second years, they have dropped out or they have switched their majors from STEM fields. So I started asking what could be driving this change? What's responsible for this, despite all the infrastructures in place? One thing I began to find were a couple of factors. One, and this is the truth, many of the students, at least on average, have a weak foundation in math and science, in the math and science education. Now, remember, we talked about diversity, inclusion, equity, and I did say that inclusion and diversity are outcomes, whereas we need an equitable platform. So for this student, we have to understand as well that they are coming into a culture where the competition is very stiff and there is an unforgiving atmosphere in this culture as well, especially in the academics, where competition is all over the place. Now you get to see as well that for some of these underrepresented minorities, there's a lack of diverse pathways. It's just standard with respect to STEM fields. And when you look at the schools some of these students are coming from, urban schools, They have limited resources that they have to apply to several multitude of students. And as a result, they get reports and results that are not as commensurate as those of their peers. And of course, many of the students as well, they're coming from families where it's poverty, there's crime, a member of the family is incarcerated, there are social pressures. These are factors that already put the minority student on the back pedal. And they come into an environment where you expect them to compete with peers who underwent Kumon, they underwent how to take notes when taking classes. These are experiences some of the students never had. Dr. Mendoza mentioned having role models. Some of the students don't even have such in the society they come from. And as a result of that, they already are behind. And even when they squeeze in and they get the program started, by the second year, the competition is stifling. It is stifling. They decide and migrate to other less competitive areas. So when you look at all these factors, disparities in affordability, gaps in discipline, reduced access to advanced placement programs, when you look at all of these factors, it just puts them at a starting point, which the system in many places does not even recognize. And then you say, oh, but we brought in all these underrepresented minorities and they failed, forgetting that they came in starting at a starting point, which was way behind that of their peers. Now, I can go on and on about these issues, but I'd like to keep quiet to allow other members of the panel time to talk.
Thank you, Dr. Shittu. Those were some really, really good insights. I would like you to actually give you a little bit more time to talk, just to go further with what you said. Given all the barriers that you spoke about, let's look at on the flip side that if we don't focus on the barriers or the fact that someone is starting at ground zero, how can we promote to organizations to tell them like what are some of the advantages that they can achieve by promoting STEM diversity, equity, and inclusion within their workforce? Dr. Mendoza talked about brainstorming and groupthink. What do you think are some other advantages that organizations can achieve if they were to promote DEI?
Oh, tremendous advantages, tremendous advantages. And I'll tell you from experience. So one of the things I'm doing in one of the projects I'm working on, studying this problem, is trying to understand, okay, why do we have this as a fundamental issue? And, we got support from the National Science Foundation to study what we call anticipatory cognition, right? We wanted to know how are the students able to weave the extant knowledge they have with their anticipation of future expectations. And from there, we studied stereotype threats. We studied self-identity. Do they even identify as engineers? Some of the students are like, when they tell their uncle or cousin or whatever that they are studying engineering, they're like, seriously? You, Dio, you're studying engineering? You understand? So identity issues, stereotype threats. And then there's also the issue of self-efficacy. In other words, I'll present a very simple graph for us to kind of internalize. When you look at a simple graph on the horizontal axis, I put the level of students' skill set, how advanced a student's skill set is. On the vertical axis, I'll put problem complexity. What I'm trying to stress with this graph is what a guy studied in 1978, Vygotsky. He calls it zone of proximal development. When a problem is too complicated and a student has limited skill set, you discover that the student is frustrated, okay? Anxiety, anger, frustration sets in, they abandon the problem. On the other hand, if a problem's complexity is not too high and the student is heavily skilled, you realize that the student feels like, this is too easy. Then they become bored. There's apathy setting in. The question here is, if there's the mentor program in place, they can guide the student into the zone of proximal development. So in terms of the advantages, just getting back to your specific question, in terms of it spurs innovation. It encourages innovative thinking, out of the box thinking. This semester, I'm teaching a new class that we call engineering for social innovation. Engineering for social innovation. In many cases, people think about engineering as a means to an end. Oh, I'm going to make dollars and money and all that. But here we have a group of 15 dedicated students who are from diverse backgrounds, and they are bringing into the context of this course imaginations that we would never have thought of if we're not in such a diverse setting. So that's one thing you see within the academic setting. They come up with innovations on problem solving. And then when they come together in a team, that is when you are unleashing the unlimited power of collaboration, where there are no barriers, no boundaries, and they are free to express themselves. And when you put all these factors together, it augments positively for the growth of the institution. The institution does well in research. The product of the university are highly competitive in the job place. And as a result, the economy benefits. It's like the invisible hand in economics. The economy benefits when everybody is brought to the table. Remember what I said earlier about what Verna Meyer said? She said, diversity is being invited to a party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Okay, if you're invited to a party and you're asked to dance, then you are not being included. And that right there is the message I'm trying to pass across. Enhancement of productivity. I can go on and on.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Shittu. Ms. Tasnim, if you wouldn't mind chiming in on this as well, if there's any additional advantages you believe organizations can achieve by promoting STEM DEI in their workforce.
Yeah, one of the things, at least like working with the Medicare population and in tech, I would say like a concrete example of the benefits of diversity is working in a field where everyone's first answer is, well, build a website or build an app, right? And then you get to a Medicare population that's over the age of 65, and then you have to take a step back and say, well, that's not going to work. Right. And here are the reasons. Some of these people live in rural health areas where they don't have the connectivity that we have. So like connectivity first and foremost is an issue. Then you have the like comfort with technology with cell phones. So a lot of the Medicare population doesn't have access to a smartphone or to a laptop. And if they do, they don't really know how to use it, or they might not have the mobility to use it. So I think one of the advantages to diversity is just that, being able to think broader, because if we thought our jobs were done by saying like, here's an app, people will figure it out, we have done a disservice to our customers, right? And if the end goal is to get customers and market like adoption of any product that you put out into the world, and you don't know that customer and you don't think about that customer because you don't have that diversity of representation internally, it is a huge issue. And so I think that is a like huge advantage of diversity. Like I have been in rooms before where people say like, oh, but I have One Medical, which is a concierge-based subscription service. I'll just text my doctor and I get an answer. And I'm like, that's an added cost on top of your already like paid premium, right? You have to think about the socioeconomic impact of suggesting an idea like that. People are getting very meager Social Security returns and might not have a 401k that they can tap into to pay for this, right? Like if you boil down a subscription fee, translate that into how many hours you have to work on minimum wage to pay for that subscription fee. And it's those questions that get asked in a meeting that influence how your end product is developed. So I would say that is one of the major advantages of diversity. And to what Dr. Shittu was saying, diversity to me is not identity. It is not, oh, we have this like rainbow colored room, therefore, you know, we're good. We're going to build the best product out there. I think diversity is beyond just identity. Diversity is what your lived experience is and your empathy for others and your ability to adopt that empathy and have that drive your decisions that you're making for your product or your service.
So I'm going to draw a little bit on something that you just said, Ms. Tasnim. You said that diversity, equity, or inclusion is not a rainbow. Could you discuss a little bit more about what diversity, equity, and or inclusion is not? We hear the terms a lot, but I think that it'd be interesting to look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, I think as somebody who has initially, I think when I like started college, I did not benefit from diversity, right? It like did not serve me well personally. It like I was always flagged as like the only girl in the classroom, right? Like so like by sophomore year, we started off freshman year with 5 women in engineering and like 50 or 60 men. By sophomore year, it was down to me and about 50 men, right? But then like where diversity started to hurt me was like you have like the guys started to pick each other as roommates. So they are constantly around each other, talking about homework, talking about problem sets, solving problems, right? But like I didn't have that luxury, you know? And then, so then like what was mentioned earlier on the panel was like finding the smart people to study with, right? Like, so that was a tactic that I took, right? Like finding the people where you can inject not only academically, but also socially. So that way they remember to invite you to these parties. So you're around these conversations as well and getting that access to the knowledge that they're also sharing with each other. But then like the flip side of it is then you start to get a reputation, right? This is the woman who starts to hang out with like all of these like guys who's all constantly in people's apartments till like 2 or 3 in the morning, right? No one realizes you're just a nerd with your calculus book showing up, you know, and like walking home at 3 in the morning after having done a long round of calc problems or what have you. Right. And then you talk to your professors and they're not super supportive either, because like a lot of times you hear from professors like, well, your grades don't really matter because you're going to go on maternity leave at some point in your career. So like, why bother? Career's not important. And I'm like, well, I paid way too much tuition for it to not matter. Right. Like I'm not here out of voluntary reasons. I am paying to be here. So like the first 4 years of adulthood was just this. And it is a really, really crappy feeling to like enter adulthood like that, to be like, oh, you are different. And not be included. So to me, what diversity and inclusion is not, because like the university gets to check that box. They get to say like, oh yeah, we got a woman in this program, right? Like we're good, we're diverse, and she's a woman of color. Great, 2 check boxes, right? What they don't see is the inclusion factor. And so to me, diversity without inclusion is not helpful. And so like when I'm doing like hiring or anything like that, like it's not just looking at the rainbow that you are bringing in. It is looking at like what that inclusion looks like once that person shows up. And on the inclusion side, like in terms of like work, it's again, like people are like, oh yeah, we hired a woman engineer. Great, check that box, right? But then after work, people want to go hang out and they want to go paintballing. Not interested, you know? Like,
Yeah.
I'm not interested in paintballing, but like, no one wants to go to the social activity that you are interested in, right? Because you're still a minority in that room. And so like when inclusion doesn't happen, so like, again, these guys go paintballing, they're friends over the weekends. I'm not really a friend, right? We have a 9-to-5 relationship. I go home and that's it. Or people that are parents, right? Scheduling something at exactly 5 o'clock when people have pickups to deal with, right? That is a way of like excluding people, but still checking that box and saying that like, oh yeah, we have a diverse workforce. So I think to me, what diversity, equity, and inclusion is not is like just diversity. I think this focus on like diversity officers and things like that, where we say like, oh, we have people from like disadvantaged backgrounds or people of color or people of different sexual orientation, that to me just plays deeper and deeper into like the identity politics. And it also has like a flip side of it too, right? Because then you have like this like trend coming up, people vilifying like the white men persona, right? They're like, oh yeah, well, like, you know, as long as we reduce the number of white men in the room, like this is okay. And I'm like, no, that's not okay, because white men also have diverse perspectives, right? They come from various backgrounds, whether they're coming from an urban background or a, you know, rural background or what have you. They could be immigrants, you know. So I think just looking at people and what they represent superficially and calling it diversity and checking that box is pretty dangerous. So like diversity to me, again, is not valuable unless you have inclusion with the goal of equity in mind.
Thank you. So that almost goes back to what Dr. Shittu was saying earlier. It's not about just being invited to the party, but also being invited to dance as well. Thank you both for that. I'm going to move on. So Ms. Burrell, the next question is for you. How do you manage your team to ensure there is diversity, equity, and inclusion? Specifically, how do you handle the challenges in your team in terms of hiring practices and or if this issue does come up?
This is one of our big issues, especially within the federal government, as we do try to make sure we hire diverse work staff. But I agree with what all the other panelists are saying. It's not just about hiring a diverse work staff in terms of ethnicity, race, or gender. It's also a diversity of thought. It's a diversity of background. It's looking at how we can include these people after we hire them, bringing them into our culture, providing them with a equitable uh, start in terms of every organization has its own culture. And there's this meme that's out there where this little bird is being kicked out of the nest and said, this onboarding process needs more work. Honestly, that is how I think about the equity that we're creating in our workplaces when people are starting, is that they don't really understand the culture of the organization, our diversity of thought that's already here, and how they're able to be included in that diversity of thought. Onboarding to me is very important. And it all really kind of starts in the hiring process. Who's on the interview panel? Are we making sure that we have people that have a diversity of thought on the panel? Do we have a diverse group of people on the panel? I like to make sure that when I'm hiring for a STEM particular position, as of right now, I'm over systems engineering, I'm over IT security, IT operations, data, as well as development and tools. I also like to have a person from the business on that panel. That gives you a different thought than just having a bunch of technicians on the panel. Also having women on the panel or having men on the panel, having a group of people that don't look the same, that don't have the same background, that don't even have the same type of position or technical experience helps us to find those candidates that also bring forth a gap or a skill that we're missing. Asking the right questions when we're in those panel discussions, working with each of those panel members to make sure, hey, are these the right set of questions that we should be asking our panelists or our interviewee? When we do go forward with those panel questions, we also ask about diversity and inclusion. We're asking to see if they're only thinking about it as color or as gender, and if they are also thinking about it in terms of background and their thought process and what they're thinking of a diversity. I think from our standpoint, when we do bring them on board and when we're hiring them, it's continuing that process and not just letting it fall short at the interview level. When we talk about the being invited to the party and also being invited to dance, I think that's a great thing that I'm taking away from this meeting today. And that's how I look at it, is to continue to have the person invited to dance all throughout their career, to make sure that they are a valued and contributing member to our organization. And that's kind of the inclusion part of it, but it's also setting them up for success. It's looking at it and saying, okay, we've hired this person. What else can we do to upskill them so that they can continue to be a member, a contributing member to our organization? So those are some of the things that we do at the National Archives and any position that I'm in where I'm actually having to do hiring.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mendoza, is there something that you would like to add in terms of how do you handle challenges within your team or hiring practices to ensure there is diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yes, absolutely. I've had previous roles where I was chief engineer for NGA, running the architecture and engineering group, as well as when I was at the ODNI, I was the IC chief architect. So shepherding the community, 17 agencies to drive intelligence integration was key. And now is my new role as chief technology officer over at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, which I just started in January. So what I've learned is when we're assembling high-performing teams to produce results and outcomes, it's very important that we bring diversity of thought across the board, as previously mentioned. What we try to do is bring all the stakeholders together so that we can drive behaviors towards mission outcomes. And when we have these meetings, we make sure that everybody is heard and that everybody has a voice. So it's up to the leader to make sure that we're fair and equitable with hearing from the different folks. At times, it gets to the point where there's women that are talking and sometimes men. we'll cut them off. Assume noble intent, but they're so excited about what they're thinking, they cut the women off. And so I make sure that I'm assertive to say, oh, great idea, Jim, that you're stating, but let's put that on pause for 1 minute. Let's hear from Sarah. She wasn't finished talking yet, to make sure that everybody has a fair voice. And one of the things that we do, as you all know, in systems engineering and solving complex problems so that we can build mission outcomes, we look through the lens of people, process, technology, and content. And when I say people, diverse people across the board, Office of General Counsel, folks that understand international affairs, process, policy, law, executive order, as mentioned previously by another panel member. It's very important that we bring the talent to the table, because we have to look through the lens of all those so when we drive results and outcomes. So how do we bring all that together so that we can produce results, so that we can achieve our goals and objectives? And it's very important that as leaders, that we're helping the folks be successful on the team, that we make sure that we match their skills that are commensurate to the job they're trying to do, as well as allowing stretch goals so that they can achieve and do more. And it's very important that they can see themselves in the mission and the results and outcomes so they understand how they're contributing to the overall organization to achieve success.
Thank you. So as we're coming close to the end of this, I'd like to ask all of you one last question. If you guys wouldn't mind taking about 30 seconds to respond to each, I'd like to get essentially a chance for each one of you to answer this. All of you are accomplished leaders in your professions. What is the most important recommendation you would give to people of diversity pursuing positions in STEM? And we'll start with Ms. Tasnim.
I would say always know and believe that you belong. Like, there will be a lot of people along the way that tell you you don't for X, Y, and Z reasons, but know that you belong and like believe it and behave that way. And when you get the chance to become a leader, like make sure that others feel like they belong along the way.
Thank you. Dr. Mendoza?
I believe it's very important to develop guiding principles. They shape our character, they're who we are, and they help us be true to our thoughts. And for me, there's five, what I call the 5 C's. C's for Cynthia: being confident, being courageous, ensuring that you're compassionate and showing the empathy. Make sure that you're collaborative, that builds trusted partnerships, and commitment. When you say you're going to do something, make sure you follow through. So find out what works for you. Everybody is different, but I believe it's very important that you have these guiding principles because they build who you are and help you stay true to who you want to be in the future.
I am definitely going to make a cheat sheet of Cynthia's 5 C's. I love it. That's awesome. Dr. Shittu?
Thank you very much. I think I'll speak to the students who may be listening to this or watching this, wherever you may be. I want to give you 4 nuggets to take away from this. As someone who has been on both sides of the aisle, I'll tell you, number 1, there are institutional resources for you to take advantage of. For example, at GW, we have the Office of Diversity, Equity, and I think Community Engagement, ODC we call it. There are staff members there waiting just to hear from you. Pop into that office and take advantage of that. Number 2, there are multicultural student organizations that are really supported right in the dean's office. I have had meetings with a group called C's Together, that's School of Engineering and Applied Science. This is a group of diverse students that are being included in the decision-making system that we have here in the School of Engineering. And this is right under the dean's office. So please join these groups. It is essential for your well-being. You find similar like-minded people as you are, and you cooperate and collaborate. Number 3, always be ready to jump at any practical instances where you can get outside of the classroom experience. For example, research experiences, okay? Reach out to professors. Tell them you're interested in their research. Try to contribute to what they're doing. That way you'll be breaking those barriers, those silos. And the last thing I'll say is that There are student support services that are strictly educational, and they are being woven into the fabric of the administration of the university. For example, within the School of Engineering, here at GW, we have Mr. Jonathan Rangon and Miss Naja Ogudiro, who are waiting for students to reach out to them. So please, students, if you are listening to me, reach out and take advantage of these opportunities. Don't go through whatever challenges in silence. Those days are behind us. Reach out, reach out, reach out. I keep quiet.
Thank you, Dr. Shittu. Ms. Farrell.
I would say always have a mentor. I think having a mentor is important in your career, as well as someone who is knowledgeable in the field of study that you're trying to reach or that you're in. Have a support group of other people of like-minded, as well as those who are not like-minded, to study with them, to work with them, to ask different questions, to bounce ideas off of, and also to always be open to new challenges, open to learning new things, open to expanding your thought process, as well as feedback. Always understand that feedback is a gift. Sometimes it's an ugly tie that you get for Father's Day, but it's still a gift. Understand that feedback is important, to take it, to learn from it, and to grow it as a employee and individually as well.
Thank you all so much. A special thanks to all of you, Dr. Mendoza, Dr. Shittu, Ms. Burrell, Ms. Tasnim, for your time today and wonderful insights. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us, and thanks to our host, GW. We are at the end of our event. Links to this video will be sent directly to all attendees in their emails. Please feel free to share them with others, and we look forward to you joining us for our next CVP Speaker Series at GW event. Details will be coming out shortly on our website. I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon.